way to get an overview of metrics, how they're related, and how they're calculated. And we'll also cover some trends in order to help you draw business insights from each of them. Now, as we covered in our Medium post and the first webinar, this is the metrics tree that we use at Google Play, which is based on daily revenue. But remember that not all of your metrics have to be on the daily level. You can change them to weekly or monthly, depending on your app's definition of success for engagement. But let's quickly recap how to read this tree. Every metric will have a parent. And if two metrics have the same parent, you'll multiply them together in order to get the parent value. So for example, we have daily active users and average revenue per daily active user. If we multiply those values together, they'll equate to our daily revenue. The only time that this rule does not hold is when there's a dotted line around the metric. In that case, you would sum the values instead of multiply them. So for example, daily active users equates to the sum of our new installs and our returning users. But for today's webinar, we're going to focus on the left side of the tree around daily active users. So what are our daily active users? They're the unique number of users that opened our app on a given day. And it's calculated by summing the new installs that you have coming in, as well as the returning users. So looking at kind of acquiring new users, we can break this down as well. So when we're acquiring new users, it's the first time that they're opening the app. And we can get those from two different channels. We call it organic, which means they're coming in on their own volition and they're very interested in our title. Or what we call at Google Play is deep link. So many of you may be more familiar with the paid channel here, but we call it deep link just because at Google Play, we don't have insight into the specific channels that a user's coming in on. So we like to think about it in a kind of more broad view. So anything that's not from the Google Play Store would fall into our deep link bucket here. But we can also break each of these two metrics down further. So our organic and deep link new users can be broken down into impressions, which would equate to how many people actually saw your store listing on Google Play. How much traffic are you driving there? And as well as conversions, which is going to be the ratio of users that saw your store listing and actually chose to install the app. So let's go through. You're going to actually multiply the impressions and conversions in order to get the parent value of the organic ratio of new users and the deep link ratio of new users. So let's quickly cover how you would think about driving more impressions on the store. So you have these levers of driving more impressions or driving more conversions. So if you want to drive more impressions or improve maybe your organic traffic, say, consider the virality of your app or game. Is there a natural social activation with the users that are in there? Or think about how you're getting people excited about your brand name or any franchises that they're using and telling their friends about it. And if not, try implementing a social feature that will help that, one that incentivizes users to invite other people so that they're enjoying the app or game with someone else that they're interested in. Now, if you're looking to improve your deep link traffic, remember that one of the most important aspects of product marketing is identifying your target audience and ensuring that your app is showing them the clear value proposition. All of your paid campaigns are likely very well thought through, and you want to make sure that you're measuring that well to make sure that the dollars you're spending are not just bringing in volume of users, but very qualified traffic. And if you are working on social channels with videos or other marketing content that's directing people where you want them to be, make sure you're taking a look at they're getting there as easily as possible with as few clicks so that there's not as much friction for them to actually install your app or game. Now, in terms of driving conversion, we have some Google Play products that can help you do that. We have Google Play Instant, which allows the user to actually engage with your app or game before they install it. You can also think about doing store listing experiments directly on the Google Play Store. So understanding which icons, is your description clear enough? All of those are really, really useful. And then we have Android app bundles as well. And you can learn more about all three of these on developer.android.com if you're interested in utilizing any of these Google Play tools that we have for you. But we're going to spend majority of our time in this webinar on the returning user side of this. And we've touched on a few metrics on acquiring them, but again, this is going to be really, really important. So what is the returning user bucket? Returning users is the set of users who aren't necessarily new. They're coming back for a second, third, fourth, or another time. And it's really important that we're getting new users in, but we're also keeping them. So you want to think about how well you're driving them back into your app, as well as, what percentage of that install cohort is actually coming back into the game. But let's go into a more detailed calculation of retention that we briefly covered in our first webinar series. Now, I like to think of retention as one of the primary installs performance metric. And that's because if you can't retain new users, how can you think about monetizing people in your game if you really don't have that many users left? So focusing on retaining them will allow that purchase potential for the users that are coming back. And the retention equation itself is pretty simple. It's the number of users active on a given retention day divided by the number of installs in your cohort. And this is an example of what the curve would look like. Now, I do want to highlight that this calculation that I'm talking about is a very classic approach, talking about specific day of return, which means that the user has opened the app on a specific day. And there are other methods. Maybe it's the ranges instead of a spot day or a rolling retention, and each of them have merit. But for the KPIs that we're covering in this series, we're going to focus on the classical approach of spot day retention. And we can break this retention into two types of retention. We have early retention and we have late retention. But what I want to dive into now is each of these and how engagement of a user throughout their lifecycle can impact your retention metrics, as well as some common trends and pitfalls that we found here at Google Play to help you understand if there's an opportunity to improve your retention. So starting with early retention, we're going to focus specifically on day 2 retention. And as a note, I'm using day 1 for a new user's first open of the app. Some of you may be using base 0 for your retention days, which is totally fine. You just have to subtract 1 from any values that you see in our retention calculations within this webinar. But the data that we're going to look at compares day 1 minutes played to the day 2 retention. And when I was on the mobile developer side, this wasn't something that I regularly looked at. You're probably focusing more on maybe how far they're getting into your game, or maybe the tutorial checkpoint that they're reaching during your onboarding, which is definitely something you should be tracking, especially because you want to understand if the users are engaging with the key action within your app or game on their very first day and how it might impact retention. But this setup of day 1 minutes played versus day 2 retention is a more apples to apples comparison, and it's a relationship that we've been leveraging at Google in order to help our partners increase their installs performance by giving you an understanding of what to expect, no matter whether you're an app, a game, different genres, or different categories. So what this graph is showing you is the length of time that a new user engages with the title on their very first day versus the percentage of users who come back the very next day. And this is just an example trend of what you would expect. And what you should see is that the longer that a user spends in your app or game, the more likely they are to return. And that makes pretty instinctive sense, right? It's pretty reasonable to assume that the longer a user is spending in your app or game, the more interested they are, the more they're enjoying themselves, and therefore they'll have a greater chance of returning the next day. But we have been able to identify 2 key patterns that you can check for that might be pitfalls. The first one is something that we call the flats. And this is an anti-pattern that shows relatively flat retention for the first 10 minutes of a user's experience, with the percentages only rising after that 10th minute in their experience. And the second is what we call the gorge. So here we actually see retention dropping minute by minute for the first 5 minutes and only then beginning to rise. So if you haven't looked at this metric before, it might be really useful to understand which portion or how much time in your app or game is driving this pattern to ensure that you can negate anything that you're seeing here. If you are seeing either of these patterns, the flats or the gorge, a few things that you can think about is whether or not you have a large secondary download. This can definitely cause many users to bounce out if they're not on a good wireless connection or maybe just aren't interested in having such a large app on their phone. You can also think about your tutorial. Is it interesting enough? Is it too long? Does it really give me an understanding of what I'm going to get from the app or the game? Also take into account any loading times that you have. If there's a long loading time between one screen to the next, that may be kind of a clear indication that I have a reason to leave because I have to wait before I can actually continue to get into the action. And finally, make sure that your lobby or your kind of home page is really instinctive to your new users. If after the tutorial, I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do next in order to continue to get the value from your app, it may actually cause users to churn. So make sure that it's very clear what I'm supposed to do next after the tutorial is completed. But now let's cover some engagement trends that are good to monitor and some trends that you should expect when you're looking at later retention across a user's life cycle. So what we're looking at here is an example trend of the engagement for retained users over their life cycle. But it's really important to consider what your key engagement metric is. If you're a game, maybe it is how much time they're spending in your game, but it can also be maybe the set of core actions that you want them to be taking in your core game loop. Is it playing a level, starting a battle, or even collecting resources? If you're an app, maybe you should also try and understand what your core action is for your title. Maybe it is app opens or time in app, but maybe it's something a little more specific, similar to what we talked about in games. Maybe for something like a fitness app, it's logging a workout or watching a fitness video that you're providing them, as opposed to just opening your app on a given day. Now, naturally, you would expect that someone who retains in your app or game will see an increased or at least a stabilization of engagement over their life cycle. So you can see here the green line is increasing engagement for the retained users throughout their life cycle, and that's a good indicator of continued strong retention of those users. Stabilization can also be a positive thing depending on the use case for your app or game, just seeing how much your users are willing to engage with your title. But generally speaking, seeing a decline or that orange line in your engagement of your retained users is usually a leading indicator of churn. So this is something really useful to monitor in making sure your users are engaged for your title, especially for more veteran users. And if you happen to see a decline, try and figure out whether there's an opportunity to target these users and continue to show them the value of your app or your game in order to mitigate any possibility of churn. Now, I don't want any of us to forget that churn is natural. Users can find other products, and generally it can be very difficult to retain users for an extended period of time. So I wanted to make sure that we're breaking out returning users in another way than just the simplified retention calculation. So what this is doing is breaking out returning users into two buckets that we would sum in order to get our total returning users. So we have our retained users, which is looking at the users who are still active in your app or game. But we also now have this idea of reactivated users. So those are the users who have left your app or game and maybe have returned after an extended period of time. And both of these can be calculated using the retention calculation, but it is important to distinguish across the two. So reactivated users are helping us understand how many users that we've lost and we're able to win back by reactivating them. And your churn definition may vary, even for apps in the same category or games in the same genre. So really think through how many days a user has to be absent in order to be considered churn. Maybe it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Maybe you only want your users to come in twice a year if you're a travel app, but really thinking about what you're considering your churn definition is. And we all know that another way to increase our active user base is to simply reactivate users who have previously shown interest in our product and seen the value of it. So if you're thinking about doing a reactivation campaign, once you have them reactivated in your title, it is really important to think about how you're introducing or maybe reintroducing features that they haven't seen before, or features maybe that you know they were very engaged with previously. And that's because over time, we all know that we're innovating and creating new features in our titles. So you want to make sure that any new updates that you have are surfaced to them immediately so that they're not coming in confused by seeing almost a whole new app or a whole new set of features that they aren't sure how to engage with. For example, if you're thinking about dating apps, lapse and churn is very natural. Maybe they found success by using your dating app, and they were in a relationship and somehow that relationship ended. If that relationship happened to end and they rejoin your app and you know that they've been there before, maybe take some time to do a re-onboarding tutorial for any features that are new or different that they never engaged with previously or may not have seen before, in order to drive a higher chance of retaining them. Now, there's one last thing that I want to touch on here based on some of the questions that we received in our first webinar. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions, as we definitely read through them at the end and try our best to respond. The topic, though, is around lifetime value, or LTV, of a user. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want to share that there are some KPIs that we covered here that are very important to this metric. But what is lifetime value? Lifetime value helps you estimate the value of a specific user during his or her lifetime in your app. And most commonly, this metric is used to understand your user acquisition. So really trying to figure out what is your return on your ad spend or your ROAS for different channels that you're testing or targeting, and understanding when your break-even point is or your return on investment and you're kind of now making money against those users. But it can also be used to understand your title's profitability, how new features are impacting your existing users' LTV after launch, and more. But the reason I want to mention this is because there are a few ways of calculating lifetime value, and one of them is the most relevant here, depending on your title's retention. So again, there are lots of ways to calculate this. This is just one example of the lifetime value calculation. So in this, you're going to look at the multiplication of your spot day retention multiplied by your average revenue per daily active user that is retained on those given days. So with this calculation, you can use it to understand how well your specific channels are performing, whether it's worth the cost that you paid or the cost per install that you were bringing in. And this is because you naturally expect different retention rates and monetization potential from different channels. So driving stronger retention from your titles will drive a higher opportunity for purchase potential for your users and hopefully increase your lifetime value. Now, I know we covered a ton of KPIs and different trends to help you track and optimize for different things, but ultimately you know your product the best. So hopefully you can use this new KPIs tree to drive stronger traffic into your title and use those different channels to understand your return on ad spend by utilizing LTV, but also drive strong retention and understand the opportunity to reactivate any of your churned users. And remember that a new user's engagement is crucial to early retention, but also that the user's engagement over their life cycle is really useful to track to understand how it can impact longer-term retention. Thanks for joining in, and let's jump into some Q&A. So let's start with some questions that we got from our registration forms for people who registered before the webinar. The first question is, are there any best practices to driving more conversion on the Google Play Store? It's a really great question. I personally believe A/B testing is always the way to go. You can test things like your icon, maybe you add a video so your users can get a really good understanding of what you're offering with your title, and ensuring that your screenshots are always showing the most important or your best features that are in your app. And the great thing about Google Play is they allow you to have up to 5 specific listings in order to have more strong conversion or impact in very specific markets that you might be targeting. So really great question, but make sure you're always testing it and you have the ability to test a lot of things in your Google Play Store listing using the listing experiments. The next question is, do you have any suggestions on reactivation campaigns? It's a really good question. I would say my quick feedback is consider if your app or game has any type of seasonality and try and use those times to run your reactivation campaigns, as it's probably a natural time that users are considering rejoining your app or game. But user acquisition strategy plays a key in any reactivation campaign, and you and your team are going to know what's best. But I think seasonality might be one small thing to consider. The next question is, how do you know the difference between, a lapsed user and an infrequent user before flagging them as churned? Another really, really great question. I think every app or game has a natural use pattern for users, and that can be different from competitors in your category or in your genre. But one thing that I would suggest for you to help you understand what that use case pattern is to break out your daily active users, or whatever your key active user time frame is. Maybe it's not daily, maybe it's weekly or monthly. But break those users out into the last time that they were active. And that can help you understand, where is majority of my users falling? Are they logging in every day? Are they logging in every other day? Maybe it's every 4, 5, 6, 7 days, but that will help you understand what is the expected use case for your title for the users that are active. And then that can help you understand what is my kind of point of churn, or how do I flag somebody as churned in order to be able to target them for reactivation. That's a metric I like to call daily active users by last open date. And again, you can expect different trends for different types of apps or games, depending on the kind of behaviors you're driving with any features that are in your title. But thank you for joining. We'll be online answering questions. So in the comment section, feel free to drop us a note or even feedback on this webinar or our series so far. And be sure to be on the lookout for the next Medium article on KPIs around driving buyer behavior with in-app purchases, and a follow-up webinar on monetization KPIs. Thanks, everyone.